again, Psalm 23. Looking at a life of His comforting presence in verse 4, Thy rod and Thy staff, they comfort me. We looked last week at the need of comfort. We're always in need of comfort, and that is due to our frailty and just our overall troubles. Man in his natural state is defective. He's deficient. He's weak. And on top of that, he experiences a variety of troubles and difficulties, afflictions and sorrows. So he stands in need, just in his natural state, of comfort. In the 23rd Psalm, David expresses throughout the psalm his frailty and need. Because of this, that's why he needs a shepherd. That is why he needs one to provide him with rest, because in and of himself he will not find it. It is why he needs one to guide him, and that in the way that he should go. It's why he needs restoration of soul. It's why he needs God's leading in right ways. It's why he needs God's presence for him, God's provision. Again, all of this is spoken of through the 23rd Psalm. It's why he needs God's anointing. It's why he needs the goodness and mercy of God. God is the source of comfort. The problem with God's people is they look to other sources for comfort. God is the source of comfort. We read in 2 Corinthians 1 verse 3 that He is the God of all comfort. Man needs comfort. Man needs help. That's why there are so many so-called self-help books. Man needs help. But one of man's problems is that he seeks help. He seeks comfort in the wrong things. So tonight we want to begin to look at the means of God's comfort. He says here in verse 4, Thy rod and Thy staff, they comfort me. Rod and staff, tools, of course, of the shepherd. They play a vital role in maintaining a flock's well-being. The significance is brought out here in verse 4 of the rod and the staff. You notice it does not say Thy rod and staff. It's not what it says. That would be grammatically correct. Nothing would be wrong with it. But for the purpose of emphasis, it is Thy rod and Thy staff. Again, it could be Thy rod and staff. But that wouldn't say as much as Thy rod and Thy staff. In so many of the translations, these are the things they take out, amongst other things. But these are some of the things, because they'll say the second Thy is not necessary. No, I totally disagree. It's there for purpose. And the purpose is emphasis. Again, the repetition of the pronoun thy gives significance to the rod and the staff. It gives more significance to them. So the idea conveyed is that the rod and staff in the hand of the Lord. Thy rod, thy staff. Thy rod in the hand of the shepherd, thy staff in the hand of the shepherd, and used by him. He uses the rod, he uses the staff. So we hear David say, thy rod and thy staff. Now again, he could have said, thy rod and thy staff comfort me. But he didn't. He said they. Now again, many people would say, well, the they's not necessary. Well, but it is. Because again, it's emphasis. He's emphasizing the fact that this rod is his. It's God's. This staff is God. And they, that is the rod in God's hand, comforts me. The staff in God's hand comforts me. So again, it's very important that we pay attention to words. Thy rod, not thy rod and staff, but thy rod and thy staff. And it's not thy rod and staff comfort me, but it's thy rod and thy staff they. They referring back to thy rod and thy staff. So again, it's a matter of emphasis. David found strength, just like a sheep will find strength and assurance seeing the shepherd with the rod and the staff. David found strength. David found new vigor. This is what comfort is. David found relief. He found assurance. He found encouragement from the shepherd's rod and the shepherd's staff. The shepherd's rod and the shepherd's staff in the shepherd's hands. So whether David was being made to lie down in green pastures, or being led by the still waters, or having his soul restored, or being led in the paths of righteousness, or whether he was walking through the valley of the shadow of death, which of course reflects death and discomfort and uncertainty. Wherever he was, didn't matter. He says, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Not just comfort in the valley of the shadow of death, but again in the green pastures, in the right paths, in all aspects of life. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Again, here in verse 4, he's gone from talking about the Lord to talking with the Lord. So David is not just talking about the rod and the staff. He is personally experiencing the rod in the shepherd's hand, personally experiencing the staff in the shepherd's hand, personally experiencing the rod and the staff ministering to him. So tonight we want to begin to look at this rod. It speaks of many things. Again, most people, and it's erroneous, it's no big deal, but most people make the rod and the staff one instrument. The curved end, of course, being the staff, and the stick being the rod. But in those days, there was really two tools. There was a rod. It was like a club. And then there was the staff, the stick with the crook. So, the rod. The Hebrew word is shavekta, and it can refer to several different things, and it's used in several different ways. It can refer to, I believe it's translated 10 times in the Old Testament, scepter, which of course is emblematic of authority, emblematic of power. It is also translated a stick, which was for protection and for disciplinary purposes. So it has different meanings, and I believe they all apply here to thy rod and thy staff. The rod, throughout the Old Testament, again, if it's referring to a scepter, but even if it's a stick, throughout the Old Testament speaks of authority. It speaks of rule. Again, the Hebrew word is translated 10 times scepter, which of course speaks of authority. It speaks of power. It speaks of jurisdiction. It speaks of influence. The Lord is my shepherd, and He has all authority, and He has all power in every jurisdiction. He has all control. He has influence over all. And knowing that, which is the sovereignty of God, knowing the truth of the sovereignty of God, should be a source of great comfort for every child of God. And just as the sheep could look at the shepherd and immediately feel at ease, that should be the case with us as well. The sheep could see the shepherd with the rod and the staff, and they knew all is well. And the child of God should always know that. All is well. Why? Because God's in control. Can't be any other way. It has to be well, because God's the one running everything. And the rod speaks of His authority. The rod also speaks of protection. It was used, of course, in the defense of the sheep. The shepherd would use it to drive off wild animals, also to defend against enemies that might try to steal the sheep. The rod speaks of the strength of the Lord as our shepherd, which again is a source of great comfort. Notice in Psalm 2 and verse 9, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. That rod speaks of God's strength. And thy rod speaks of the strength of the shepherd, strength exercised on our behalf, or on the sheep's behalf. Psalm 110 and verse 2. The Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. So again, it speaks of strength and power. In Isaiah chapter 11, Isaiah 11, verse 4. But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth. So it speaks of, it's emblematic of his power on, again, our behalf. So God, the shepherd, is not only strong, but He is our strength. He's not just a source of strength. He is strength. He doesn't derive His strength from anyone else. He is strength, and He is the ultimate source of the strength we need. And that rod is emblematic of the strength. Notice in Psalm 28. Psalm 28 and verse 8. The Lord is their strength, and He is the saving strength of His anointed. He is. He is the saving strength of His own people, the delivering strength of His people. Psalm 46, verse 1. Many times we look at God's strength incorrectly. He is the strength. He is strength. In Psalm 46:1, God is our refuge and strength. And again, this rod speaks of His strength. Psalm 73, verse 26. My flesh and my heart faileth, but God is, present tense, ongoing, is the strength of my heart. God is the strength of my heart. Psalm 81 and verse 1. Sing aloud unto God our strength. Again, God, our strength. Psalm 84:5. Blessed is the man whose strength is in Thee, and whose heart are the ways of them. So the assurance of this is a source of great comfort to the child of God. Again, the shepherd would use this rod to defend the sheep against wild beasts. The sheep, they're helpless. They really can't do anything as far as wild beasts are concerned. Their whole life is in the hand of the shepherd. It's all dependent upon the shepherd. And so it is with us as God's people. Again, John 15:5, without me ye can do nothing. We are completely dependent upon Him, His power, His strength. He fights the battles of the sheep. Notice in Exodus chapter 14, and we're reminded of this over and over concerning our own life. Exodus 14. In verse 14, the Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. That is, He's telling the Israelites, you don't need to do anything. The battle is His. We're completely dependent upon Him. Exodus 15:3, the Lord is a man of war. The Lord is His name. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 1. Deuteronomy chapter 1. And verse 30. The Lord your God, which goeth before you, He shall fight for you according to all that He did for you in Egypt before your eyes. He goes before you. That's what the shepherd does with the sheep. And He is their defense. So there's no need. There's no need for a child of God to be fearful. Doesn't mean that we're not, but there's no good reason. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 22. Ye shall not fear them. For the Lord your God, He shall fight for you. You shall not fear them. For, here's the reason why. God. God is your strength. God is your defense. And we see this all the way through. Notice in Psalm 7. Psalm 7. Again, the rod is an instrument of defense that the shepherd would use. But the Lord Himself is our defense. Psalm 7 verse 10, My defense is of God, which saveth the upright in heart. Psalm 59. Psalm 59 and verse 9. Because of His strength will I wait upon Thee. For, or because, this is why I'll wait upon Him, God is my defense. So He's our defense. The rod represents the fact that He is our defense. Verse 16, But I will sing of Thy power, yea, I will sing aloud of Thy mercy in the morning, for Thou hast been my defense and refuge in the day of my trouble. Verse 17, Unto Thee, O my strength, will I sing, for God is my defense and the God of my mercy. Psalm 62, verse 2, He only is my rock, my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. He only. He only. That's where all our confidence is to be in the Lord. Notice in verse 6, He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. And then in Psalm 94, verse 22, Psalm 94, 22, But the Lord is my defense, and my God is the rock of my refuge. So the persuasion that God is our defense, nothing can get through. That's a source of great comfort. And the sheep could look at that shepherd with the rod, and that sheep knows, I'm safe. The sheep could eat, it could graze in peace, and the reason being is because the shepherd was there, and that sheep knows that shepherd is that sheep's defense. Nothing can get to the sheep. So that's a source of great comfort. The rod was also used to number or to count. Notice in Leviticus chapter 27. Leviticus chapter 27. And we'll read verse 32. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the 10th shall be holy or set apart unto the Lord. So it was counting. It was using the rod to count the flock, to count the sheep. And if 100 sheep passed under that rod, then they knew that 10 sheep was to be given, was to be set apart for the Lord. In John chapter 10, we'll not turn there, but in verses 1 through 4, Christ uses the analogy of the sheepfold. And in Palestine, there was, in the villages, there would be sheepfolds, which were the property. The land was owned by the native farmers, and these sheepfolds were walled. You remember Jesus said, if some man climb up get in some other way. It's not talking about getting into heaven some other way. That's another subject. And at nighttime, these shepherds would lead their sheep to the door of these sheepfolds, and they would leave them in the care of the porter, who is, of course, is a type of the Holy Spirit. And the shepherds would return the next day for their sheep. Now, when the shepherd would leave his sheep with the porter, the sheep would pass under the rod. And again, a porter was counting the sheep. Okay, this shepherd has 95 sheep. So then when the shepherd would show up the next morning to get his sheep, again, 95 sheep would have to pass under this rod. It was used for counting. It speaks of the shepherd's awareness of each sheep. He knows exactly how many he has. And that rod would be used to count the sheep. So it speaks of possession, it speaks of ownership, but it speaks of the fact that the shepherd watches each sheep individually. They belong to the shepherd. Now, the New Testament teaches us that we belong to Christ. The sheep belong to Christ in really three different ways, or we, His people, belong to Christ in three different ways. We belong to Him by gift. We were given to Christ by God the Father. Again, John chapter 17 makes that quite clear. We belong to the shepherd by purchase. John 10 and 11, He purchases each one of His sheep. And we belong to Christ by inheritance. Ephesians 1, verse 18. But there's great comfort in knowing that the shepherd looks out for each sheep. And he knows exactly how many sheep he has. Knows exactly. He knows everything about that sheep. So there's great comfort in knowing that we belong to Him. There's comfort there. If you can't get comfort there, you're not going to get it anywhere else. That we belong to Him. And He watches out for us. He's our defense. Notice in Psalm 79, and verse 13. So we, thy people, and sheep of thy pasture, we belong to Him. Everything about us belongs to Him. And the sooner we get a hold of that, or it gets a hold of us, the better off we'll be. We belong to Him. It's not my life, it's not your life. We belong to Him. Psalm 95 and verse 7. For He is our God, and we are the people of His pasture, and the sheep of His hand. Today, if you'll hear His voice, harden not your heart. Again, we are the sheep, we are the people of His pasture, the sheep of His hand. We belong to Him. Psalm 100, verse 3. Know ye that the Lord, He is God. It's a good thing to know. It is He that hath made us, and not we ourselves. And again, that's another good thing to know. He and not we ourselves. He and not we. And then he goes on to say, we are His people and the sheep of His pasture. So we belong to Him. This rod also speaks of discipline. It was a tool of chastisement. Sheep, just like God's people, need correction. The thing about chastisement, and we dealt with the Lord's chastisement in quite a while back in the 23rd Psalm. But the thing about God's chastisement or discipline that we must never forget is that it is instruction. All discipline should be instructional. That's the point of discipline. And this rod would be used as a tool of chastisement, not just to hit the sheep, but to correct, to teach a lesson. Notice in Job chapter 21, Job chapter 21, and verse 9. Their houses, speaking of the ungodly, Job is feeling sorry for himself. He's saying their houses are safe from fear, neither is the rod of God upon them. And there's some truth to that. God does not discipline the ungodly like He does His own. Just like you don't discipline someone else's children like you do your own. In Psalm 2, verse 9, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Now he's talking about the ungodly, the unsaved, in final judgment. Thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. And then notice in Psalm 89 and verse 32. Then will I visit their transgression with the rod, and their iniquity with stripes. So the sheep, looking at the shepherd, he has his rod, and they know, again, it's thy rod. It's in his hands. That means it's correctly administered every single time, because it's thy rod. It's not anyone else's. It's the Lord's rod. And then, of course, all through the book of Proverbs, we see the rod is used as an instrument of chastisement. It is used as an instrument of discipline, of correction. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 13, in the lips of him that hath understanding wisdom is found, but a rod is for the back of him that is void of understanding. So the rod was a source to help to understand. And that was so with the sheep. If you had a sheep that continually wandered off into something that was going to be harmful, that sheep needed to understand something. You don't do that. That's not good. That's not good for you. So the rod is for those who do not have understanding. So it's used to give understanding. In Proverbs chapter 13, Verse 24, he that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth. Now that doesn't mean beat. Again, it's correction, it's instruction. It's a means of instruction. Chasteneth him betimes, or over and over, until the lesson is learned. And that's what the shepherd would do with the sheep, and that's what God does with us as well. Proverbs 22, verse 15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child. Why is that? Well, because of depravity. It's bound in the heart of a child. It's there and strong. But the rod of correction, it's instruction, shall drive it far from him. So this rod of the shepherd is again used for instructional purposes. It's discipline. Proverbs 23 verse 14, thou shalt beat him. Well, let's go to verse 13. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Thou shalt beat him with the rod, and shalt deliver his soul from hell. So what was one of the purposes of the rod? To deliver one from their own ways that are destructive. Hell is destruction. And so that they do not continually do those things that will destroy them, that's why it's the rod. And so it is with the Lord. He uses the rod to deliver us from ourselves, to deliver us from destruction. Proverbs 26. Proverbs 26 and verse 3. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. Again, the one who just does the same destructive thing over and over. Because you don't want that sheep to destroy itself, the shepherd would correct it with the rod. So when we read, thy rod, discipline doesn't, again, Hebrews makes this plain, isn't pleasant. It's not something you, oh yeah, I want that. One of the most foolish questions that a parent will ever ask a child, do you want a spanking? No, I don't. I understand why the question's asked, but it's really a foolish question. And the Lord uses this rod to correct us, to keep us from destroying ourselves, because we do the same things over and over. Proverbs 29, verse 15. The rod and reproof. Now you have two things. Rod and reproof give wisdom. So the rod is used, again, to correct. It's used to discipline the sheep. In the book of Micah, if we turn there, book of Micah, this is a good piece of advice for all of God's people. Micah chapter 6 and verse 9. The Lord's voice crieth unto the city, and the man of wisdom shall see thy name. And notice what it says. Hear ye the rod. Pay attention to the rod. Thy rod. God's discipline. Pay attention to it. You'll save yourself a lot of trouble. Hear ye the rod. And then notice, and who hath appointed it? It's in the Lord's hands. Hear the rod. Pay attention to the instruction. So, thy rod speaks of the Lord's chastisement for the purpose of teaching us, for the purpose of correction, for the purpose of delivering us from our own destructive habits. So there should be great comfort in knowing that we are under the loving discipline of the Lord. We all need boundaries. God has hedges, gives us boundaries. And there are consequences for crossing those boundaries. And that's true in a flock. The sheep have boundaries. You get beyond the boundary, you have subjected yourself to the rod. The purpose of the rod is to bring you back within the boundaries, because everyone functions better and everyone's happier when they are within the boundaries. And I believe everyone's happier when they know the boundaries. And so the Lord teaches us, these are the boundaries. Don't go over here. This is the boundary. And it's just good to know. I know the boundaries. I know the boundaries. And it gives assurance. And the rod in the shepherd's hand gives assurance to us that there are boundaries. And as we mature, we learn, you know what? My life is a lot happier. My life's a lot easier if I stay within the boundaries. And so the Lord is good at disciplining us with His rod. Thy rod, the psalmist says, comforts me. Because the psalmist knew that the rod was perfectly exercised in the Lord's hand. He knew that it was with love and care and was for His own good, so he found great comfort in the rod. And so do we. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in a verse of song. Let's all stand.